the co-president of the Bordentown Historical Society. And I'm actually here, right to my left, my left. That is my husband's hand. He is the other co-president of the Bordentown Historical Society. Oh, there he is. And we've been working hard all year to honor Clara Barton. So one of the things I want to say is that this talk is being recorded so that folks that were just not available are going to be able to hear it. And we just wanted to make sure everybody's comfortable with that so that, we can share this with other folks. There'll be some questions asked down the road. And I do think, I think it's going to be great to have it available for other people who are unable to be here today. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker. And our speaker is Professor Jane Scimeca, and she teaches at Brookdale Community College, where she holds the rank of Professor of History. And that is in Lincroft, New Jersey. It's in Monmouth County, for those of you who may not know that. And Jane earned a master's degree in history and graduate certificate in women's studies from Rutgers University. She teaches a variety of courses, including women's history, World Civilization 1 and 2, and New Jersey history. She recently presented her paper entitled "The Price of Liberty is Maternal Vigilance, Understanding Women's Political Engagement Since the 2016 Election" at the national conference, which was called Since Suffrage, and that was at Auburn University, which I guess is in Maine. Is that right, Jane? Is Auburn in Maine?
No.
Or no?
It's in Alabama.
Oh, in Alabama. Okay, well, thank you. Her publishing credits include the article, "Pink is the New Red, White, and Blue," and that was in the Asbury Park Press in March of 2017, and several ancillary texts for Houghton Mifflin Publishers. She's also a contributing author to the Encyclopedia of New Jersey. Her area of academic interest is in women's history, which is why it's so helpful for her to be here today to talk about Clara Barton, an American icon. And she developed the curriculum for Brookdale Community College, first course in women's history, in 1995, and collaborated to develop Brookdale's Women's Studies program. Over the last 25 years, she has taught thousands of students about the history of women in America. So we're so proud to have her here. She speaks frequently on campus, and she speaks in the community on topics relating to women's history. And actually, the way I connected with her was because I was going through some Bordentown Historical Society things and found a flyer from many years ago when she actually was a speaker and came to the Friends Meeting House in Bordentown and spoke about Clara Barton. And that's why I reached out to her. Happily, we connected, and I'm so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming. And we want to record this. We're supposed to remind everybody, yes?
Yeah,
We're
it's being recorded.
Okay, and again, please mute yourselves, folks. That would be really appreciated. Thank you so much.
Bonnie. Thank you so much. And so I am so happy to be with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always, it's always Women's History Month at my house, and a day with women's history is always a good day, in my opinion. So today we're going to talk about Clara Barton, and the title of my talk is "In Her Own Words." So I was really interested in presenting a talk on Clara Barton, and to find a different approach. Like Bonnie said, she's an icon. What don't we already know about Clara Barton? Is there anything new to find out? So my approach today is going to be looking at Clara Barton's life through her writing. So without further ado, let me get started. So just like Bonnie said, I don't mean to repeat here, but just here's me teaching, and I am a professor of history at Brookdale Community College, our beautiful campus in Lincroft in Monmouth County, New Jersey. And I hope if you're ever in Monmouth County, you are able to drive through our campus and enjoy the beauty there. And I've been teaching there for 27 years, and I absolutely love teaching. I love our students, and women's history is my jam. So let's go. This is what I do. So just to get started here, let me just introduce my approach. So in this particular talk, we're going to be examining Clara Barton's diaries, her letters, her poems, her speeches, and some of her published writings as well, to understand her career as well as her private life. And what we're going to try to do by looking at these sources is to be history detectives. We're going to try to investigate a little bit about what makes her tick, from the way she wrote about herself, the way she wrote about events that she experienced, and see if we can understand something new about her life. And getting ready for this talk, I read an article from the American Historical Review by Lois Banner that was published in June of 2009, called Biography as History. And in Lois Banner's article, she is talking about writing biography and questioning whether is writing and talking about history through people's biographies, is that an inferior type of history? Because actually biographies had kind of come under criticism by the historical profession as sort of being lightweight, you know, that you really don't get good history from reading biographies. And she disputes this, and she says that if we write biographies with context, with all the historical and cultural baggage attached to the person's life, we get something called thick description. And that resonated with me so deeply, that if we talk about somebody's life, we can connect it to the larger historical story. And so in the case of Clara Barton, we can look at what were women's lives like in 19th century America. What was the war like, right? We can keep the story of other things connected to her biography, and we end up with a thicker story, right? We end up with a thicker connection and understanding. And she really thinks that if we are able to do that, that we will, as readers, as students, we will have really a greater emotional connection and a greater resonance with that person, and that it makes the learning experience more meaningful. She also urges us to be interpreters and detectives, illuminate the past and interweave its threads in new and compelling patterns. So by studying someone through their biography and connecting it to the larger historical story, we really end up with a rich experience. So that's what really I want to do today, right? I want to tell you the story of Clara Barton, but I want it to be rich. I don't want it to be thin. And so she kind of concludes her article by saying that a life deeply lived moves across space, time, and areas of human involvement, both capriciously and predictably, validating certain accepted historical construction while challenging others. Now, who is better to talk about than Clara Barton, right? Because we know that in certain things, it's very predictable. Her life does fall predictably along, but in other things she does, definitely challenges what's going on in history. So she moves deeply through time and space. She lives 90 years. She's deeply involved in society. Also, she is really a perfect example of this, this advice that Lois Banner gives us in her article. But, you know, when you look at what's out there on Clara Barton, there are tons and tons of children's books. And the young woman who is here today just did a whole project on her, right? She introduced herself earlier and explained her project. And so Clara Barton is well known to children, that she is probably the most famous woman in American history. And because of this proliferation of children's history on her, we get this heroine themed narrative about her life. And this kind of falls in line with a pretty well-known historical process, which is called the great man theory. And Thomas Carlyle wrote in the 19th century that the history is but the biography of great men, that all you need to do is to study the great men and you will understand history, right? You study the life of Napoleon, his talent, his courage, his superior attributes, and you understand the history of France, right? That you understand the history of the French Revolution. So this is, I think, a problem for Clara Barton, and that we really need to look at her life as being far messier than that. We don't want to take the great man approach. We don't want to just say she's an angel, she's fantastic, she overcomes these odds, and feel that we understand her. Because we need, as Lois Banner actually also recommends, to look at the sources. And that's really my entire jumping off point for my talk today, is that I want to look at what is in the archive, what is available in her hand, right from Clara Barton's own brain and fingers, and to really understand her on a much deeper level, to not just understand this greatness, but to understand the messiness. And we really, if we look at her writings, I think we will be able to get to know her in a more honest way and as a more of a human being instead of up on a pedestal. So here is a picture of some of her writing and her beautiful signature at the bottom of the page as well. One of the things that makes this also perfect approach for Clara Barton as a subject is that she leaves over 100,000 pages of documentary evidence. That her papers are in the Library of Congress, as well as in many other archives, hold letters of hers. And so between all her writing, her letters, everything that she compiled through her life, we have volumes of evidence that we can examine. This is extremely, this is unusual in women's history. In women's history, we usually have very little to find that has been preserved. But Clara Barton is just an amazing example of so much being there for us to look at. So it's certainly a wealth of riches here. We have an embarrassment of riches to look at. So we're going to be looking at some of this stuff, and I'm going to be reading some of it to you. I'm going to be showing some of it to you. So you're going to have some things to look at as well. So I'm going to use her own accounts. And these are the things that I really concluded by examining her writing. Throughout her whole life, she shows a consistent commitment to service to the country, service to her community, and also service to preserving democratic values. And I think this is one of the things that really go beyond just the heroine image of her as the angel of the battlefield, but that her level of commitment to service of others is really exemplary. Her writings also show this belief in maternal feminism, which means that she looks at herself as a woman and that women are naturally nurturing, women are naturally mothers, and women naturally understand how to take care of people. And she constantly uses this language in her writing when she talks about her work. She uses this kind of language, and I'm going to demonstrate that through some examples of letters, etc. She also, in terms of preserving democratic values, always is looking to do good and to protect the common good. And for those of you who remember your American history class, right, from the early period of the American Revolution, that the Enlightenment philosophers and people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams talk a great deal about creating a country dedicated to the common good. And Clara Barton really understands this, and she really makes it part of her life work to preserve the common good. She also uses networks of other women to coordinate relief and donations. This is something I think that largely gets left out of the Clara Barton as heroine story. She is not alone doing this, but she relies on her network of other women, friends and acquaintances and associates to help her to accomplish these larger goals of relief, larger goals of community service. And she's also a leader. And we don't necessarily naturally think of women as leaders in history, but she truly is a leader. And her leadership abilities are very clear in her accomplishments as well as in her writings. She, through Bordentown's opening the public school, I'll talk a little bit about that story, how she leads in trying to improve the nursing and feeding of the Army during the Civil War, and her leadership in establishing an American Red Cross and leading to coordinate the disaster relief in so many places in the United States. So her life is not all rosy. And so Charles Dickens writes that it is said that life has its roses and thorns, right? We all have our roses and thorns, things that are good, that happen, that are wonderful, but also our thorns, our tragedies. And this is human. This is not a knock on her. This is not criticism of her. This is life, right? We all have roses and thorns. And her roses, I think one of her roses is that she is a very highly intelligent woman. And when we look at the way she writes, how she expresses herself, her description, it's beautiful. And she's a clearly highly, highly intelligent person. We can see that in her writing. She demonstrates clear leadership ability. Her leadership ability is remarkable for her era. And she's probably one of the first great women leaders in American history. She also is a trailblazer. She's the first. We could go down a list of all the things she does. That is the first woman to testify before Congress, the first woman to do this, the first woman to do that. And her humanity. She is a great humanitarian. Her generosity, her compassion to others, and her desire to alleviate suffering is really without peer. I think that these are really her great, great accomplishments. But she's also really deeply unhappy in her personal life. And there are very few times in her personal life where we could say that she's really a happy person. I think that if we had to sum it up, we would say that overall, she's a pretty unhappy person in her personal life, that she suffers periodic bouts of depression. She talks at a couple of points in her journal about suicide. I'm going to share that with you as well. She describes, she writes a poem that I'll share with you later that describes herself as very lonely. And at the end of her life in particular, she's very lonely and she suffers terrible traumas. And she sees some horrific things on the battlefields. Her descriptions of some of the battles, many of the battles of the Civil War, are horrifying. And how could she not be impacted by the carnage and the bloodshed and the loss of life? And she held numerous men's hands as they took their last breath. And that takes a toll on a person. So she experienced terrible trauma in her Civil War experience, but I also think she had trauma in her childhood. So I'm going to play a little bit of amateur psychologist a little bit and look at her words from her childhood, how she describes childhood trauma as well. So roses and thorns, and this is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So she talks in her memoir, she writes a memoir of her childhood, and it's published in 1907. So she is quite elderly when she published this memoir of her childhood years. And she really wrote it because so many school children were writing to her and asking questions because they were learning about her in school. And she said, you know, instead of writing a letter to each of you, I'm just going to write my childhood memoir. So let's look at what she writes and examine her words here. So in her childhood memoir, she does, you know, include some of the messiness. As I said before, we're going to get into a little bit of the messiness and get away from the heroine image. She describes herself as timid and shy and bashful. She is extremely shy. She talks a little bit about the excessive work in her life. As I said, she does experience some physical and mental breakdowns and depression as well. So where's the trauma in her childhood? She writes, in the story of my childhood, in the earlier years of my life, I remember nothing but fear. And that really shocked me when I read that. I was like, what is she afraid of? What is she talking about? What is this fear coming from? Where is it coming from in her childhood? And so let's explore that a little bit. You know, let's take that first. She recalls happy memories also, but her happy memories are when her family moves into her cousin's farmhouse. And because of family circumstances, her father bought her cousin's farm to help them out, and they all moved in there. And those were happy memories. But when she grows up and she goes to school in Clinton, New York, also, she never comes back. You know, once she gets out of there, she never returns. And so there's definitely something for us to question here. We can ask some questions here about some childhood issues. So from the childhood story on page 72, and you'll see I'm going to use this green arrow. I use the green arrow to kind of direct you to where I'm going to read a little bit. So I'm going to read a little bit about this childhood trauma that she experienced. She's walking into the barn and the men are going to be killing an ox. And she just happens to walk in there at the wrong moment, right? So this is what happens. They were all trying to get a large red ox onto the barn floor, to which he went very reluctantly. At length, they succeeded. One of the men carried an axe and, stepping a little to the side and back, raised it high in the air and brought it down with a terrible blow. The ox fell. I fell too. And the next thing I knew, I was in the house on a bed and all the family about me with the traditional camphor bottle bathing my head, to my great discomfort. As I regained consciousness, they asked me what made me fall. I said, someone struck me. Oh no, they said, no one struck you. She faints, right? So she is, she sees this horrible thing. She faints. And at the end of the passage, she describes that for the rest of her life, she doesn't eat meat. So she is really kind of permanently affected by this, by watching this. And so she said she loses all her taste for after this. So what do we see here? We see an example of a pretty traumatic experience. And we see that she continues throughout her childhood to be timid, to be afraid of giving trouble to anyone. And so who's she going to give trouble to? What is she so afraid of? And I find this to be very intriguing, you know, to try to get to the bottom of this. And she looked about anxiously for some useful occupation. So she wants to be useful. She doesn't want to be a bother. She's trying to make sure that she can be helpful and not cause any trouble. So let's think, what could she be afraid of, or what could be bothering her? I think that part of this has to do with her mother. She describes her mother, and here's a picture of her mother on the slide. She describes her mother, and again, the green arrow is where I'm going to talk. My mother, seeming to conclude that they were plenty of instructors without her, attempted very little. And I have a question about that. You know, what does she mean? My mother attempted very little. Could it mean that her mother neglected her, didn't love her, didn't show her a lot of affection? that she left her to other people in the house to look after her. And her mother at the end of the passage says that Clara Barton came out more level-headed than she would have thought possible. So she's not really a very doting mother, is she? So there's that, right? So she's talking about fear. She has these couple of traumas. And so her biographer, Elizabeth Brown Pryor, describes her as a personality at odds with itself, that she was not very good at taking care of herself. She's not very good at administering first aid to herself, right? She's good at helping other people and not so good at taking care of her own needs. And so, this part may be also part of the reason why she's drawn to trauma. She's drawn to trauma on the battlefield to help people at the battlefield. She's drawn to trauma in the Red Cross to help people in the Red Cross in disaster relief. But maybe she goes because it's really her own trauma she's really trying to fix, but she doesn't know how to do that. And so I think that this might be something for us to consider in terms of the messiness of her own life. Pryor also calls her a beloved heroine who dies alone, and that her own life was frayed and she couldn't fix her own life. She could fix other people's lives, but not her own. So this is a little bit of the messiness that we can find when we look at the sources. In 1876, when she is about 55 years old, she writes a poem. And this was actually in conjunction with her living. She had gone to a sanatorium for depression, and she stayed there for a long time in Dansville, New York. And she joined a nice women's group there called the Betsy Bobbitts, I think it's called. And she wrote this poem about herself. And I just want to read it to you because I think it also corroborates this theory about her depression and loneliness. A poor lonely maid, like a vine, she has swayed, her tendrils unclasped and her branches unstayed, while the tall trees all around her waved rugged and free, with no one to bless, to soothe or caress, no fond heart to beg for one loose flowering tress of the let down back hair of lonely Betsy, CB, Clara Barton. So she writes this sad poem that she's lonely, that she doesn't have. I don't know if you guys all remember this, but people used to put in a locket. They would have a locket and they'd put a lock of hair in it. They'd put somebody's hair that they loved in it. Nobody wants her hair. She says, no one wants my flowering tress, right? So that this is sort of a reflection a little bit on the fact that she is sad, she's lonely, and she's kind of an unhappy in her relationships, right? So let me go on back to the story of my childhood and talk a little bit about some happier memories from her childhood, okay? So she also has happiness in her childhood, and she describes it and describes herself as not playing with dolls, that she doesn't really like dolls. She never played with dolls, but she loved playing with the boys outside. So she was a little bit more of an outdoorsy, rough and tumble kind of young lady. And she loved spending time with her brother David in particular, who was a bit of a wild man. And he teaches her everything: how to throw a ball, how to tie a knot, how to ride a horse, how to drive a nail. And she writes in her memoir, I wondered if these were the best, most useful lessons of my life. Because, hey, did she need all these things when she went to the battlefield? Yes, right? So she ends up really using these skills in the future. So in and here she is with a horse, and she was a great horsewoman. She was really, her brother taught her to ride astride. So she didn't ride side saddle, which was the custom of the women at the time. She rode astride. So when she's, in danger at many of these battles, and she gets a horse, she's able to get away. She's able to gallop far and fast, right? So this was really useful skill. And so this is a great memory, right? That when her brother actually puts her on the back of a wild colt when she's 5 years old, right? She's 5 years old, her brother puts her on the back of a wild colt and says, hold on. And, so this is this wonderful, funny memory, It was his delight to take me to the field, sees a couple of these beautiful young creatures broken only to the halter and bit, and gathering the reins in both bridles firmly in hand, throw me upon the back of one colt, spring onto the other, and bidding me cling fast to the mane, gallop away over field and fen among the other colts with glee. So she really has some happiness, right? Some happy memories. And so she also wants to learn how to ice skate, right? So she talks in her childhood also about she wants to learn how to ice skate. There's a big pond out in front of the house, and she loved the pond and the ducks and everything, but she also wanted to skate in the winter. And of course, she lived in Massachusetts. The winters are long and cold, right? So she wanted to engage in that kind of fun as well. So looking at the Green Arrow again, that's where I'm going to read. She wrote, "The boys were all fine skaters. I wanted to skate too, but skating had not then become customary, in fact, not even allowable for girls. And when one day my father saw me sitting on the ice attempting to put on a pair of skates, he seemed shocked, recommended me to the house, and said something about tomboys." And I actually think that that's a term that's kind of completely fallen out of use now, but that she was, kind of, told you can't do that, right? You're not allowed to skate. And even though she really wants to, and she's confused as to why can't I, right? This becomes, I think, a pattern in her life. She wants to do stuff, and the men are telling her, you're not allowed. No women on the battlefield. No girls don't do that stuff. And she never accepts it, right? She persists through it. So what do these stories tell us from her childhood, right? She enjoys being with the boys. She doesn't want to play with dolls. She wants to play outside. She wants to ride horses and go ice skating. She even wants to work on the farm. She liked working on the farm. She liked that kind of hard work outside. And they get the house painted at one point. She works with the house painter. She loved working. And she recognizes, though, that women's lives are restricted. And she doesn't like that. Right. So she makes note of it. Even as an old woman, she points out to the fact that, women were not allowed to do things. And I think this becomes really part of the tension throughout her life, throughout her words. We see this tension, what she wants to do versus what she's allowed to do. And in women's history, we also like to put women in the context of the time. And so I want to talk to a second about the role of women in America. And a couple of really important historians, Linda Kerber, Carol Birkin, have written that women have an important role to play in American history, especially after the American Revolution. Women were crucial for the success of the new country because they were going to be responsible for teaching children in the home how to be good citizens in a republic, Republican values of virtue and morality and equality and rights, that these had to be taught to you when you were little tot. You couldn't wait until you were 10, 12 years old to learn what the values of the republic were. You had to learn this from babyhood, from toddler land. And that women were going to have to do this because men didn't raise children. Women were the ones raising children. And I think Clara Barton really understands this, that women's role in the country does have a political aspect to it, right? And so is she a Republican mother? I think she is. She talks in her memoirs about the influence of her father. Her father was an enormous influence on her. He was a veteran of the wars on the frontier. He served under General Mad Anthony Wayne. And he regaled her with all kinds of stories about battles, and she loved it. She drank it up whenever he would tell her his war stories. And she talks, and this is a transcript from one of her speeches that she gave, and I've kind of highlighted in yellow what I want to emphasize here. So from this speech, she says that if you feel that I occupied too rough and unseemly a position on the battlefield, I can only say to you that they were rough and unseemly for men too, right? So if you're telling me that it was not a place for me, it wasn't a place for anybody. It wasn't a place for men either. And then she goes on to say, but under all lay the life of the nation. So here's the democratic principles, right? I had inherited the rich blessing of such health and strength of constitution as is seldom given to women. I'm a strong woman, she's saying. I've got good health and I can hack it. And felt that some return was due from me, that I ought to be there. And if there are not apologies sufficient, then my father was a soldier. And even when a child, my heart leaped up to hear him tell of struggles fierce and wild. So she's talking about this even as she gets older, about in her speeches, when she would give a speech, and you go, you're going to tell me I don't belong there, that nice women don't go to the battlefield and experience this. I'm telling you, I'm strong. And my father told me these great stories, and I belong there because I could do it and I wanted to do it. And he inspired me to do it, right? So she really talks a great deal about her father and his influence. She gives another speech also that is a great example of Republican motherhood. And I'm actually going to read a larger section of this because I really want to, it's a beautiful, beautiful speech. And this is one that I find some of her most moving and most patriotic of the writing that I read for this presentation. So I'm going to read a little longer section here, so forgive me. I remember a patriot hero who bore the flag over the bodies of his fallen comrades to plant it on the blazing heights of Fredericksburg until both arms fell useless at his sides and the shoulder received the precious burden his hands could no longer uphold when planting his foot firmly by the resting staff. His clear voice rang out above the shouts of the charging ranks, the hissing of shot and the shrieking of shell. Don't let it fall, boys, don't let it fall. And it did not. And while he lay armless, sergeant in his little hospital bed in the snow-clad camp, his colonel wrapped carefully the tattered silken folds, dabbled and dyed in patriot blood, and sent them home to the governor of the state with the message that the old regiment had never lost its colors, but it had worn them out and wanted more. There, with its scores of companions grouped around the pillars of that State House hall, it hangs tonight. In some noble hall have you your own like treasures gathered? And your hearts have heaved with grateful pride and your eyes grown dim with gathering mist as you beheld them? Oh, what a consecrated hall. At what price it has been decorated? What granite could rear that could speak like this? Go there often. Take your children there. And from those tattered rags, teach them the worth of their country. Tell them that for every rent they can count, 10 brave lives went out. 10 mothers mourned a son. 10 orphans walked the streets. 10 homes are desolate. And when all this is estimated, tell them that alongside of each tattered remnant, there should droop another fringed in black, whose center should bear only the terrible word starved. And when they ask what caused all this, tell them it was disrespect for the laws of the country, disloyalty, treason. Procure for them no foreign teachers, send them away to no classic schools. Tell you have first taken them there and taught them this, that treason is a crime, loyalty is virtue, and eternal vigilance the price of liberty. So what does this show us about her, right? She is extremely eloquent. I mean, this speech just like brings me to tears. Her deep understanding of the principles that were fought for. And maternal feminism, right? This idea that women have to teach their children, right? Teach your children these things. Teach your children what the Civil War was about. Teach your children that they have a responsibility to be loyal citizens, or else all these men that died, that was a waste, right? That we have to make sure that the lesson is learned from the Civil War. And so I think she was extremely effective speaker, and also really, I think, conveys these Republican motherhood values. It's one of my favorites, that speech. And then she writes another letter later in her life to a friend. And General Elwell was one of her boyfriends. She had a romantic relationship with General Elwell. And she, after their romance is over, they continue to correspond as friends the rest of their lives. And she writes him a letter about women in the military. And I read this and I go, holy, Title IX, Clara. You know, that this is really so far ahead of her era. And so she writes General Elwell, and so the handwritten copy is on the right, but the transcript is on the left. So I'm just going to read you a couple of lines from this letter to show you her understanding and her belief that women have a place in the military. She writes, if it were left to me to recommend the process by which a nation should be raised to the highest standing of military fame, whose warriors should constitute its chief glory, I should commence by instituting military academies for its women, for the daughters who will one day become the mothers of its army. They should be active and brave and strong and fearless, capable of understanding the plan of a campaign. But women, ladies still, like they'll still be ladies. And so she really understands that, first of all, women suffer during the war because they have to suffer the death and the death of husbands and children and sons, but also that women can do it. You know, she has this deep belief that women are capable of being there. And so at the very end, she says, so then as a patriot and for the sake of my country in the future, God bless the man who sustains the woman that follow their husbands to the field, right? So she is very consistent, I think, in her writing about women and patriotism. She's also a Republican mother because of the way that she treats her students. And although she has no children of her own, she does not marry and she has no natural born children, she does become a maternal figure to her students as a teacher. And there's a pretty famous relationship between her and one of her students from Hightstown. And she taught at the Cedarville School in Hightstown in 1851. And one of her students wrote an article about her that was published in the New York Tribune in 1898. So many, many years after the Civil War was over. What happens is that this student of hers that she had in 1852, I think, ultimately also joins the army during the Civil War. And she runs into him again when he is injured and she's helping the soldiers. And then she runs into Hart Bodine again. So Hart Bodine writes this piece that talks about her as a teacher, and then again as a running into her again in the Civil War. So, you know, she continues to see these boys who she was a teacher to. And so in the article, I just excerpted, obviously cannot read that newspaper, but it's just for effect. This is the newspaper article. And here on the left is the transcript. And so she takes over this schoolroom in Hightstown. And apparently the boys were renowned for being kind of ruffians, kind of tough. So she handles this not with strict, harsh discipline, but this is how she handles the rough boys in her new school. That she pleasantly asked him, meaning Hart Bodine, to assist her in carrying out the whips. So there were whips in the classroom, okay? Not fully understanding her meaning, Hart shambled up and alert for her dodge, as he thought. I guess he thought he was going to get smacked. But when she had them carry them all out of doors and break them in small pieces and tenderly took him by the hand, assuring him she would never need them, for he was one of her big boys and she could depend on him to help her keep order in the school. In the midst of her work of mercy among the soldiers in Virginia, she learned of Bodine's presence in the army and ordered an ambulance to take her to Brandy's station, where she took a bundle of clothing, cakes and jellies for her former pupil. And so what does she do for this young man, right? So she's got a very maternal teaching style, right? So she gives him love. She doesn't give him corporal punishment. She doesn't hit her students. She treats them with love and respect, and she gets that in return as well. And when she sees him again later, she brings him supplies and love again, right? And so many years later, he writes about this relationship with her. And he also, when he has a daughter, he names her Clara Barton Bodine, right? So that she makes this lifelong impression. And so she's a maternal figure. She imparts Republican motherhood to her students because she instills in them the values of morality and goodness. And that's part of the Democratic message, right? So is Barton a conventional mother? No, right? She's single, she doesn't have any children. She's not submissive. And really, women at that time, we have to remember, were supposed to be frail and submissive and stay at home, which is why she's always apologizing for going to the battlefield, right? She's always saying, oh, I know you say women aren't supposed to be here, but I'm strong and I can do it. And I want to help. So she's not in the home. She's not married. She doesn't have any kids. She's not submissive, that's for sure. But she uses this same maternal language in all her writing, that she talks about her relationship with her students, with the soldiers, and even the Red Cross she refers to later in her writing. She refers to the Red Cross in toto as her child, right? So she's always using this language. Why doesn't she marry? I just mentioned she's single and childless. If really all women pretty much married then, why doesn't she? Now, her books do describe her as unattractive, and I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. I don't think she's unattractive. I mean, she may be a little on the plain side, but she's not ugly. I think that we only need to use our eyes to look at her pictures and realize she is not unattractive. If she wanted to get married, she probably could have, but she would have had to compromise her standards. She has some love affairs. Her biography talks about a relationship with Joshua Ely, who was a farmer outside of Philadelphia that seems to end for unknown, mysterious reasons. She doesn't write about it in her journal. She leaves a lot of this out. The young men that she was seeing, she only refers to with initials, so we really don't know who they are. Suffice it to say, none of the love affairs that she had as a young woman work out. She probably could have gotten married if that was really, really, really what she wanted. But she doesn't compromise her standards. She gets sort of depressed after she breaks up with, when she and Joshua Ely break up. She does go into a depression. But she's also extremely intelligent and a forceful personality. She doesn't, she's not going to compromise in order to comply with social conventions, I think. And so just getting to know her strong personality, she's not going to cave in and just marry just anybody. That's my feeling. So here's the man who I think she really has maybe the most best documented love affair with. And this is Chief Quartermaster John Elwell, who she wrote that earlier letter to regarding women in the military. And he wrote a letter to her where he wrote, "I loved you to the extent that the law allowed, and perhaps a little more." And in this relationship, it's troubled because she met him during the Civil War in South Carolina, and he was married. And she never expected that he was going to leave his wife for her, although they have, a pretty hot love affair. She was in her 40s. She wasn't a 20-year-old girl. She was a mature woman by that point. And so she is loved, and it makes me happy that she had somebody who loved her and that she had a little romance in her life. Even though it doesn't end up being a marriage, her biographer does conclude pretty much that it was a consummated relationship. So she definitely is loved. The career is also a kind of an interesting question. Remember, women in the 19th century really did not have career options. That the only career that most women that would be respectable would be teaching. There was also social work, missionary work. Social work comes later. Social work comes later. Library work comes later. But teaching was really the only respectable job. Otherwise, you would have to be a domestic servant or a factory girl, work in the mill. And she did work in her brother's mill for a while. But none of these really are going to earn her a respected living, and not really respectable for women to work. And you're not going to really earn enough to really live comfortably. You're really not. So she does go into teaching. She teaches for 10 years. She has a whole career before she has like 3 careers, I think, at least in her life. She taught in Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts had a public school system, so she was accustomed to the Massachusetts system. And then after she goes to this Clinton Liberal Institute that you can see on the slide, she went to this Clinton Liberal Institute for some additional education. And there she meets Mary Norton, a good friend, and she stays connected with Mary Norton for the rest of her life, moves to Hightstown and lives with her family, Mary Norton's family in New Jersey, after going to school here. So what do we think about this teaching career? Now, I have to say, and I can't say that this is my opinion in this case. She gets these teaching jobs in Massachusetts and then again in New Jersey, but she always seems to quit them. She doesn't stay. She'll teach somewhere for a year and then she quits, and then she gets another job and she's successful at it. It's not that she's a bad teacher. She's good at it. She has charisma and stage presence, but she doesn't really, I think it's not enough for her. I think it's too low paying, too lacking in not respectable enough for her. I think she has bigger dreams for herself. I really do. I think she has bigger aspirations than to be a school teacher. So I think she loves her students, but I think she has bigger dreams. So here are the Nortons. She moves to New Jersey after she goes to school at the Clinton Institute, and she lives with this family. And here's Mary Norton in the center of the slide. You can see her here. Here is Mary Norton, and here are her brothers. And Clara was also very close with Charles Norton. There he is there. And she lives with the Nortons for a good deal of time, over a year, in this house here in what is now East Windsor, New Jersey. She lives in this farmhouse, and she writes to her nephew from there. And she said that the Nortons had a nice farm and they were a nice family, but she also gets tired of them. And her time at the Nortons, she's teaching, they are a little overbearing. They seem to be kind of always, there just seem to be a little stifling, I think, in their relationship with her. And she likes them and they're fun, but she wants to get out of there after a while. And she writes in her journal that she moves from there to Bordentown. And she said, they thought that I would soon return. I knew I never would. She says, I know I'm not going back to there. So she stays, relationship stays. She writes to Mary Norton forever. She becomes a lifelong friend, but she doesn't want to go back to the Nortons' house. And she leaves there. And so when she's living at the Nortons, she's teaching. All these love affairs, this love affair with Joshua Ely, who was a farmer outside of Philadelphia, falls apart. And she goes into kind of a tailspin, a mental tailspin. So this is from her diary. Her diary there is on the right, and on the left is the transcript. So this is what she writes. I grow more and more weary and impatient. I cannot help it. There is not a living thing, but would be just as well off without me. I contribute to the happiness of not a single object, and often to the unhappiness of many, and my own, for I am never happy. True, I laugh and joke, but could weep at any moment. So this is a dark time. This is a bad depression for her. And so the situation in Hightstown is not good. She's now 30, which means, her chances for getting married are over. She's teaching, she's not really, in love with teaching. And so she moves on, and she moves to Bordentown, right? And so here is from a manuscript she wrote about opening the first public school in Bordentown. And this is what she says inspires her to take on this challenge. So I really think teaching was not challenging enough for her. I think she really wanted a challenge. And this is the big challenge. I think this is her first big opportunity to do something with her life. And she sees, when she's walking around Bordentown, she sees these boys all around, not doing anything. And when she would stop and talk to them, they would say this. She said, why aren't you in school? And they would say, they spoke of me. They spoke of their banishment or absence from school with far less of bravado or boasting than would have been expected under the circumstances, and often with regret. Lady, there is no school for us, answered a bright-faced lad of 14 as he rested his foot on the edge of a little park fountain where I had accosted him. We would be glad to go if there was one. So she sees here an opportunity to do something, and again, for the good, right? She's doing something for the common good, not for herself, but for the good of others. And I think this is a real theme in her life. And so she writes more on this as she figures out a way to get a public school started in Bordentown. And she goes to meet with Mr. Sudam, who was the postmaster. And so this is what she writes. By this time, in his capacity as postmaster, we had formed a tolerable acquaintance. So she knows Mr. Sudam. Now, for the first time, I made known my desire to open a public school in Bordentown and teach it myself. So she says, I told him I can do it. Surprise, discouragement, resistance, and sympathy were all pictured on his face. So this is not the first time, this is not the last time she's going to see the discouragement, resistance on men's faces. And that's why I kind of highlighted it here, because this seems to be, this is going to be a pattern for her. She's going to say, I want to do this. It's needed. A public school is needed. Help for the soldiers is needed. The Red Cross is needed. And men are going to say, lady, no, you can't do this. And she's going to say, I will do it. You know, she's going to persist. And so she's really admirable in this, because she's always being, you know, she's really gets a lot of resistance whenever she puts out a good idea. So he says, no school in Bordentown. And he described the reasons why. She said he gives her this mishmash of a word salad of reasons. And these are his 8 reasons. These boys are renegades. Many of them are more fit for penitentiary than school. A woman can do nothing with them. They wouldn't go to school if they had the chance, and parents will never send them anyway. So he gives her like this whole word salad of reasons why they're not going to come to the school if they had them. Well, finally she wins. We know she wins this battle, right? And finally, she writes that the notice was put up on Bordentown, all around the town. They put this notice that the school's going to open next Monday at 9 a.m. And I'm just going to read this last paragraph here because I love this. I love the way she phrases this. This notice was read by all the men and women as they passed, shouted by all the boys as they ran. The birds twittered it through the tree tops from morning till night, and the katydids scraped and grated it from night till morning. So she says everything from the insects to the birds to the people are all excited about the school. And it's a really, and I think it's really something important to remark here, that it was actually one of the a very happy time for her. So she leaves the horrible, depressing Heightstown situation. She comes to Bordentown. She has a challenge. She meets her challenge and she succeeds. And she becomes the heroine of the town. And I think this is a big turning point in her life, because she realizes that she can do it. She has confidence, I think, as a result of this. And it was something she took on a challenge and she accomplishes it. And the school becomes a big success, and it grows and grows. And ultimately, a man is hired to be her boss, and she says, I'm out of here, and she leaves. But it's good, right? It's actually a good thing, because then she moves on to bigger challenges, right? So I think that her force of her personality and her intellect and her aspirations, her energy is for doing something big. And so I think this really was like the first test of her leadership ability and her ability to get something big done. So what does the story tell us, right? She goes to a new community. She sees they need something. They need a school. She sees an opportunity to do good, right? To bring the common good. She does it. She advocates for the reform. She stands up to male authority. She rebuffs all the resistance. She persists, and she's a success, right? I think this is the pattern of her words, right? I see a challenge. I come up with a solution. People are going to tell me I can't do it, but I do it anyway, right? And we're going to see her repeat this challenge, right? She moves to Washington and she works at the patent office. And she, again, she's a trailblazer. She's one of the first women to work for the federal government at the patent office. And at first she was making the same amount as the men, but then she gets knocked down and It's a long story there with the different presidents coming in, and she loses the job and she gets it back. And she works at the patent office. She liked the patent office, except her male colleagues treated her terribly. Because she's a trailblazer, she's the first woman to be, working there, and they spat tobacco juice on her, and they were really very vulgar and rude to her because they didn't want women there. And she writes a letter to her nephew, Bernard, saying, quote, "Were you in my place, you would feel it too, and wish and pine and fret in your cage as I do. I shall always be oppressed, no doubt." So, this is frustrating, right? She knows she's being mistreated and she just has to take it. There's very little she can do about it. And so even though she has a lot of experience working, living and getting along with her brothers, this was a pretty challenging experience for her. And if she wanted a career, right, this is what she was going to have to do. So as she's working in Washington, the Civil War breaks out. And as the regiments from Massachusetts and New Jersey are coming, they come through Maryland. And she hears that when they arrived in Baltimore, that mobs in the street that were supportive of the Confederacy were attacking these Massachusetts regiments and New Jersey regiments. These were her boys. These were boys she had taught in school. And so she's very upset that anybody would attack our own soldiers. And so she begins to collect donations and supplies. She contacts Mary Norton in New Jersey. She contacts all her connections, and she starts to accumulate supplies to help to give these boys the supplies they need, and she needs to distribute them. So this is now the next challenge, right? She sees a need and she goes into action, and she needs to get the supplies to the soldiers. And to get to the soldiers, she has to get a pass to get to the front, to where the battles are. And she can't get a pass. She can't get permission. So she goes to Colonel Daniel Rucker's office, and there's a story that's told in her biography that I think is a terrific story, where all these people are sitting there trying to get a pass, and he sees her and he asks her to come to his desk, and she has to convince him to give her a pass. And finally, the way she convinces him is she cries. And so she knows how to turn on the female waterworks when she needed it, but she's also convinces him because she says, "Look, I don't just have like a basket of muffins here. I have like 3 warehouses full of stuff that I have gathered for donations, and you really need them. So you really need me." And the army was very reluctant because, first of all, she was embarrassing them sort of, right? She's showing them up by saying, "Look, you're not ready. I can help you. You guys don't know what you're doing." They were a little sensitive about that. So she had to tread very lightly here in working with the men in the military. They did not appreciate her at first. And she has to sort of explain and justify why she's violating these norms, right? Women don't belong in the battlefield. That's what all the men say. So if you see the green arrow there at the bottom, this is again from one of her manuscripts. She writes, "War came upon us hastily and terribly. Then you and I and all of us rose up." And she means women, right? She's talking to other women. "Rose up and asked what we can do. I was strong and I thought I ought to go to the rescue of the men who fell. But I struggled long and hard with my sense of propriety." She's like saying, "I'm a nice lady, with the appalling fact that I was only a woman whispering in one ear, and the groans of suffering men, dying like dogs, unfed and unsheltered for the life of the very institutions which had protected and educated me, thundering in the other. I said I had struggles with my sense of propriety. And I say it with humiliation and shame before God and before you. I am ashamed that I thought of such a thing. But When our armies fought at Cedar Ridge, I broke the shackles and went to the front. So she says, I struggle with this too. Look, I know women don't usually go to war. I get it. It's not my, I know that women aren't supposed to do this and aren't supposed to do that. But I see a need, right? She's saying, I see a need here. I need to do it. And so she's always struggling with this, all the way back from the ice skating, right? From the ice skating to here, that women aren't supposed to do this, but she says, I want to do that. So she writes a letter to her brother in 1861. So right at the beginning of the war, I may be compelled to face danger, but never fear it. And while our soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them. She said, if they can fight, I can hand out coffee. It's not so bad, right? I can do this and I can really do some good. So what does this story tell us, right? So I'm trying to keep coming back to our theme, which is to use her words to understand her. Again, she sees the need. The soldiers do need help and she can do it. She has an opportunity to contribute to do good. And she stands up to Colonel Rucker, right? And she's going to stand up to a lot of other officers along this journey. And she's successful, right? She is a success in doing this. The first battle that she was present for, and she's present for many, many battles during the Civil War, is the Battle of Cedar Mountain. And in her diary, she writes, I can't describe it. That's how bad it was. It was horrifying. The carnage on the battlefield was beyond imagination. And she writes an article that was published in the newspapers about the experience. So why do you think she's writing an article for publication? Is she doing this for her own glory? Is she doing it to get publicity? Is she doing this to gain more donations? That's a really good question, and I'm not exactly sure. I think she does it because she wants people to know, if you donated stuff, I'm not sitting around eating the bread you donated, I'm giving it out and this is what happened. So I think that part of her is that. I think part of her is also driven to share what our soldiers were suffering. I think she really wants people to know how bad it is. And so if you look at the green arrow on the left side, she describes the battle. She says, I said we had no conveniences. We had one article of furniture, a broad table, and the death that I have seen upon it today. Oh God, how precious. From the golden ringlets of the fair-cheeked boy, the weeping, waiting motherless idol, to the blood-matted and tangled locks of the sterner, braver man who has faced death on many a field, stretched like a broad trunk of some noble tree to be shorn of its lightning-riven branches. The brightness that trickles from the edge of the floor, is it wine? Ah, who shall count the value of the wine of life, right? So she's describing this bloody scene of these young men and old men dying, and how sad it is. And she writes at the end there, the other green arrow on the right, would you know how our men bear their suffering? Oh, how I wish I had words to tell you of all the patience, the nobility of soul, the resignation and bravery of our gallant troops. Truly, a hospital after a hard-fought battle would seem the most unlikely place in all the world to inspire courage and ardor. But I gaze upon these men through blinding tears of admiration and respect, and sing in my heart, it is well to be a soldier. So this is really full circle, right? She respects her father's stories, and now she's having her own experiences, and she wants people to know that the war is real, and how these men are suffering. And she concludes with, at no moment of my life has our country seemed worth so much, or her institution so sacred as now. In the fearful trial of fire and blood, she shows us that she can produce and still nurture and educate and sacrifice such sons. So again, she comes back to this maternal language, nurture, educate, right? And so she is horrified as well. She writes that she wanted to be between, she didn't really want to just do hospital work. She wanted to kind of be in between the bullet and the hospital, that men would be laying in the field of battle without a drink of water for 2 days sometimes. And these men were suffering and bleeding and in pain. And so she really wanted to be on the front lines so that she could bring a man a drink of water or bring him a clean shirt, or she really wanted to be there to help feed them because they were starving. That's why she talks about starvation in that earlier speech, that food and disease, and that this was something that nobody really talked enough about. So at the end of this manuscript, she talks in this speech actually about, she's talking to these women. She says, "You generous, thoughtful mothers and wives have not forgotten the tons of nicely packed, delicious, ever rolling to the front. Huge boxes. There, these stood behind the railway track. Every can, jar, bucket, bowl, cup, or tumbler, when empty, that instant became the vehicle of mercy to convey the preparation of mingled bread and wine or soup or coffee to some helpless, famished sufferer who partook of it with the tears rolling down his bronze cheeks, and divided his blessings between the hand that fed him and his God." So she's saying, you guys are doing good. You're sending me stuff, and the men really appreciate it. So that's part of it too. So, you know, obviously the image here of the woman walking around with the water, right? That's supposed to be her bringing, just to help. She can't solve the war, but she can relieve a little suffering, right? So she was bringing, you know, food, a friendly voice, you know, that there's really heart-wrenching accounts in her writings about running into boys that she knew as students who are mortally wounded, running into boys who just wanted a friendly voice, a boy who calls her his sister's name. "Oh, Mary, Mary." She's like, "I'm not Mary, but, you know, I'm going to stand here and hold this boy's hand because it's giving him some comfort." So this was a horrifying thing. So I'm running low on time here, so I'm going to run a little bit ahead. When she is at Antietam, she's at one of the worst battles of the whole war. She writes an article to the women of Hightstown, and it's published in the paper. So this is an article she wrote 1863 to the Soldiers' Friends Society of Hightstown, New Jersey. So I wanted to include this because it was so local. And why does she write this long account? She writes this long account of the Battle of Antietam to the women of Hightstown, this open letter in the paper. And at the end, she writes, "Ladies, I learned by your recent communication and the generous remittance accompanying it that you are desirous of assuming the expense of the goods purchased by me and used at the Battle of Antietam." And she's trying to reassure them, I appreciate it. It's being used well. These men are protecting us. We need to help them because they are protecting us. And that you should be very proud. She's so grateful that these are your men, that you have relieved their suffering, their hunger, giving them a fresh shirt, you know. So she really takes does it publicly, right? So she's publicly thanking them. So she always felt like the soldiers were her boys, just like they were her students. The soldiers were her boys. She talks about the Civil Wars and her work as some of the best moments of her life. The soldiers, when she would walk into a hospital, the soldiers would applaud for her. They would cheer her. Men would show up at her door at her apartment in Washington to thank her. Thank you for doing what you did for me. So she really gets enormous respect and she gets recognition for what she does. So she wants to publicize the good that's being done and that women are patriotic, right? She's always trying to reinforce that women get it, women understand, we're not begging, that there's this sense of sisterhood and maternal feminism in her words. At the end of the war, she asks President Lincoln in February of 1865 if she can start a missing soldiers office. That now that the war was coming to an end, she wanted to be able to continue because there was work that needed to be done. There were thousands of boys who were missing and graves that needed to be marked, right? And so this is what she does for almost 5 years after the war ends. She searches for the missing. And I think one of her most beautiful letters is written to a family who reached out to her to find their missing son. So what does she do? She compiles these lists of missing men and she publishes them in the paper. She thinks that some of the best way to solve the mystery of what happened to them is to publish their name, and maybe one of the men that fought with them will step forward and say, oh, I was with Charlie and this is what happened to him. And then she can share the story with the family and give them some closure, give them a sense of what happened, right? So she's getting all these letters from families. She's publishing these lists in the paper. Here she signs the little introduction here. No apology necessary for writing me. If the letter is, I'll answer it. So she has these enormous lists of names of trying to find the missing. And she gets contacted by this one family asking what happened to her son. And she says, I don't know what happened to your son. I don't know him, but I know the regiment. And this is what happened at the battle. And she writes this beautiful letter that talks about what happened at the battle in July of 1863 at Fort Wagner. And I'll just read a little bit because I know I'm running low on time. She says, during 4 long hours preceding that charge, I watched those doomed men waiting, when those doomed men marching and waiting, I think it says, I couldn't make out one word, fixed in solid phalanx, waiting that charge of death, then 4 other hours of carnage, such as God grant you may never realize, where the rolling volleys of destruction alone lit up the misty blackness of the night. Then they bore the wounded back along the wave-crashed beach, and the surging ocean sang its solemn requiem for the dead. They lay by the hundreds, wounded and bleeding. And then she talks about her work. She said, God in his goodness gave me speed to my feet and strength to my arms through the hours of that fearful night, that I might nourish the fainting, slake the thirst of the dying, and strive to staunch the life stream as it ebbed away. It seemed as if the day would never come. But when at length its welcome beams broke over us, we were no longer swept by shot, but the field of pale upturned faces and eyes forever still. A death angel had flapped above us, and they told us of 600 that lay dead in the fort, whereon I will not ask your pardon, my dear friends, for having recalled these events to you. Your son was a soldier. his regiment well known to me, and you who have suffered so much will be strong enough to listen, while I, who stood among and saw and knew them all, relate the scenes which to him I fear were the last of his on earth. So she tells them what happened at the battle. She says, I fear he was there. But she's goes to enormous personal lengths to help the suffering of the parents. And so she has enormous compassion, right? So she goes to Andersonville also after the war is over. And Andersonville was this terrible Confederate prison that was opened in 1864, towards the end of the war. And she goes there to mark the unmarked graves there. And she writes and gives speeches about this as well. And she talks about how horrible it is. She talks about it as hell. She says, surely this was not the gate of hell, but hell itself. And that she saw that the little graves were marked. And she said, you know, this is only right, to honor and respect the memory of these men who made the ultimate sacrifice. And that she did this for the broken-hearted mother in the old northern homes. And she raised over them the flag they loved and died for and left them to their rest, right? So she says, we need closure. We need a way to bring this to an end, but we can't just leave these men in unmarked graves. We have to mark their graves. It's absolutely right. And at the end of the day, she marks almost 13,000 graves, right? And at the end of the process of marking the graves, they allow Clara Barton to raise the American flag over Andersonville, which is such a nice, fitting touch to honor her in her hard work to mark the graves of the Union soldiers who died in that prison camp. So at the end of the Civil War here, she had answered over 63,000 letters and identified 22,000 of the missing men and marked 13,000 graves at Andersonville prison. So she, 5 years after the war is over, is, filling this need. So what does this story tell us? Again, she sees a need, she sees an opportunity, something that is good that needs to be done. And she advocates for it, right to President Lincoln. And she successfully leads the effort to get it done, despite different obstacles to her finishing it. She gives many speeches, and I am going to try to wrap things up because I don't want to hold you too much longer. But I do want to just mention that she's also a feminist. And I think that this really speaks to something else that's really important about her as a single woman in the 19th century, is that she recognizes that she needs rights, that as a single woman, that she really needed equality and changes to the law and the right to vote. And so she meets Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton while she's giving speeches around the country after the war. And she became an important part of the suffrage movement. She spoke for suffrage. And there are speeches that she gave for suffrage where she talks about how she always believed in human rights and that women deserved human rights also. She also was a friend of Frances Willard, who was the leader of the biggest women's movement of the 19th century, the temperance movement. So she continues her efforts in both women's rights as well as suffrage and temperance. So she said, I believe I must have been born believing in the full right of women to the privileges and positions which nature and justice accord her in common with other human beings. Perfectly equal rights, human rights, right? So, it's not until what, the 1990s, Hillary Clinton says women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, right? So Clara Barton said that in the 1800s. So she was really the first one, I think. So she is afraid to speak. She's timid to speak. She gets stage fright, but she has great stage presence. So throughout all these speeches, she makes over 200 speeches. It's a little scary for her, but she has great charisma and stage presence. So she does very well. She commands the room very well, just like she commanded her classroom, she commanded the room. And so I just want to make a final little conclusion here. That I think that we learn a lot from examining her words that really, as I said earlier, give us a thick description of her life. Not just a list of things like she did. Beyond just the day-to-day, she did this and she did that, but really gives us a sense of who she is, her character, her fears, her talent, and that she is one of really the great leaders of the 19th century. That she demonstrates that women can challenge the restrictions that society had put on them. And she was confident that women were capable of doing much more for the country. And so despite the fact that she really constantly faced pushback from the men in authority, she persevered and believed in herself and accomplishes so much in her long life. And she continues this even with the Red Cross as well. I know that you may have questions in the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand and ask questions, that would be great. And I also know that Bonnie wants to remind you of some upcoming events as well that are coming up for the Historical Society. But I want to make sure that if you have any questions about the talk, I would be so happy to answer them for you.
Let's see, we're looking at the chat.
No questions in the chat.
No questions in the chat. So you folks, we're not muted, are we?
No, we are not muted. But I do have a question, Jane.
Go ahead.
So what made Clara go from Bordentown to Washington, D.C., and why did she pick the patent office?
She went to Washington, D.C. because she was working with her girlfriend in Bordentown, Fanny Childs. And so she quits the job and she gets Fanny to kind of quit with her. And they decide they're going to leave Bordentown. And Fanny wanted to go to Washington. And I think that she kind of goes along with Fanny. She didn't have any real plan at the time.
Mm-hmm.
She uses the patent office because she understood how to use political connections. So she gets to Washington and she goes to see her senator. Knocks on his door. She's like, hey, I live in your district. Can you help me out? I need a job. And he gets her a job at the patent office. So she was very, I think if she had been a man, she probably would have been a politician. She probably would have run for office or been an officer in the military. I think that would have been very much in appropriate thing. Lydia, you want to please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, first of all, I want to say thank you. This is an incredibly inspiring talk, really interesting. I'm glad I was able to join. I'll be I hope the recording will be posted. I'd love to share it with people. But I also, I hate to be that jerk who's like, this is not a question, but a comment. But I want to quibble a bit with your characterization of this as like a less than heroic story. Saying that this is like, saying, oh, let's complicate this and make it not a heroic story. I think it makes it more heroic that she faced these challenges and things. And, my 4-year-old little boy loves superhero books right now. And we always try to point out to him like, hey, it's not actually brave if you're not overcoming your fears and overcoming a challenge. Like, you know, if you just wave a magic wand and do amazing things, that's not heroism. So, yeah, I think your own talk sort of misproves your thesis there.
Well, I'm not saying she's not a heroine. I'm just saying I'm not going to use the great. Well, but let me comment though, because I think it's important.
Mhm.
Say she wasn't important. I was saying that I'm not going to use the great man of approach,
For sure.
which is here's this great person. They overcome these obstacles, and that it's almost very thin and two-dimensional. And I never found her that interesting because it's this two-dimensional martyr story.
Ah, interesting.
And I don't think that's that. I honestly don't think that's that compelling. I think it's much more compelling to look at it from a much thicker.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a really incredible and interesting story that you fleshed out there.
I mean, when you look at her chronology, I mean, the chronology is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, she goes to the battlefield, she goes here, starts the Red Cross. You know, but you know, there's much. That's why I think when you're doing more, when historians do archival work and they really delve into the subject by looking at sources,
Mm-hmm.
it interweaves the story in a much richer way.
Totally. Yeah. Yes, I was a really, really incredible work there, and I think it was very enriching to see that complexity. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lydia. So Jim, you want to take a turn? Just unmute yourself, Jim, and you can ask your question.
Oh, okay. I've asked this question before. Exactly where did Clara Barton live when she was in Bordentown? Does anybody have an actual address?
I did not find any address. I did not see any address. She lived in like a boarding house, I think, and
That's what I heard.
But no address was given. I'm sure if there was a census, if she wasn't here during the census, I was going to say if she was here on the decade, you could have found her on the census, but I don't know. I don't know where she lived.
Yeah, we haven't uncovered that. We just learned that she was in a boarding house.
Yeah.
Bonnie is our new Clara.
Yes, well, I have to say that first of all, thank you so much. One of the things that I really don't remember reading about was how Clara really suggested that there should be women in the military, and that's pretty incredible. But a couple of things that I thought were so interesting was that when Janet Yellen was appointed by President Biden, somebody asked her, you know, what is one of the biggest challenges that you face? And she talked about equal pay for women for the same work as men. And I was like, Clara Barton was arguing about that in 1840, and we're still talking about it. And then shortly thereafter, Biden made a speech where he talked about the same issue. And of course, you know, in reading the New Jersey Law Journal, when you read about women's salaries in some of the big law firms, you know, there are disparities. And so it's just really incredible that she was so, you know, unique as a female person, arguing that she should be paid the same amount as men. And my recollection is that it was in about 1840 where she was teaching in New York, in Massachusetts. She was teaching in Massachusetts and had taught a summer session, and then was asked to teach in the winter session. And there was a male teacher getting X amount, and they offered her less. And she said she would not work for the lesser amount. And they capitulated and gave her the same as the man.
Yeah.
So, and of course, when she worked in the patent office, initially she was paid the same as men until some new person came into in charge of the job and, reduced her salary and her,
And then she was getting paid piecework, essentially. She was getting paid by
Right.
word. And, that was very hard to make a living that way. But yeah, the whole structure of society is saying women don't belong here. Women don't belong in the workplace. They belong in the home. And so therefore women are second class. They're second class in the workplace, and that this has persisted. It's persisted in all the institutions, really. And so, and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were also barking about this in the 19th century in the women's movement, and wrote about it extensively, that women need to be able to be free. As single women need to be able to make a living and not be a sex worker, and not be just a domestic, but need to have an access to education and career so that they can be independent. But society didn't want that. They didn't want women to have those options to make decisions for themselves. And it's really only in the last, 50 years, we really see that become a reality. That change happens very slowly. And also, Jim, I don't know if you have access to your chat. If you can click the chat, somebody wrote that she lived above the newspaper office on Farnsworth Avenue.
right. Michael Skelly, one of our members.
I don't know that that's
Okay,
true.
right.
I'm going to take Michael's word for it.
Michael is very knowledgeable. He's one of the Historical Society directors and is an incredible historian.
That's
Great.
over the Bordentown Register, over that paper.
Yes, it would be, near Railroad Avenue. I think that's where the register is.
If anybody also has a question, you can write it in the chat. If you don't want to unmute, you can do it that way, and I'll address
Michelle
it.
has a question. How did she make a living during the Civil War when she was getting supplies to the soldiers?
It's really good. So she actually kept her job at the patent office, and she gets somebody to work in her job. She kind of job shares. And it's very interesting. It doesn't seem like she ever, she's never afraid to kind of bankrupt herself, because she essentially goes back, she actually almost goes broke by continuing to do this work. And she was spending her own money on bread and spending her own money on supplies for the soldiers. And so she was barely making it ends meet. And she had saved up all her salary for years when she was working at the patent office. She had been very frugal in saving her money. So she was living off that for a while. And then eventually she loses that job at the patent office. She does get some reimbursement from the government after a while for the expenditure she made, but she kind of lives a pretty hand-to-mouth existence at that time. It's only until after she starts speaking, she gives public speeches after the war is over, and she is a very popular speaker. And I think it's really interesting. Most women were not, did not attract male audience members, except she did, because she was talking about the battles, and the men who were veterans wanted to hear her talks about the battles. So because she was talking about military history, she attracted male and female audience members, which was very unusual. And she got paid a pretty good amount of money. And that is when she becomes financially stable, when she is able to earn money through her public speaking engagements and save that money. And that actually is where she finally becomes financially stable.
So just in regards to that question, she was not paid by the government for the services she provided to the soldiers.
No.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
Well, she took it upon herself. They didn't say, we need somebody to do this. She said, I'll do it. She volunteers herself. And the Army didn't have any they didn't have any organization for that. Their plan was if men were wounded, every regiment was responsible for picking up their own wounded and taking them on the ambulance. Well, what happens in the chaos of battle? You know, everything goes haywire, right? You know, none of that worked during the chaos of some of these battles. So the plan didn't work. The Army's plan for how to get wounded off the battlefield was a failure. And it takes them a really long time to kind of fix some of that. And so she helps, but she doesn't do it through the chain of command. She doesn't do it through the formal channels. So she doesn't really get paid for that. And, you know, she's sort of relying on the donations of all these people to give her supplies, even though she goes through her own money. But she doesn't seem to care about money for herself. You know, she's not greedy, I guess is what I was trying to say before. She's not really, she's not money conscious. And her one great story about her nephew had consumption, her nephew Irving, and her sister's son, so Sally Vassal's son, Irving. And he essentially bankrupts her because she wants him to get well and she keeps giving him money so that he'll get better. And of course he never gets better, he has consumption. But by the time, you know, he dies, I mean, I think she ran through almost all her money. She's so generous with people. She really is very generous and not, she doesn't seem to be, you know, money grubbing, that's for sure.
Well, thank you so much. I think we just also appreciate all of this information, some of it that's probably new to many of